Vladimir Putin has just signed a decree that establishes the general staff inside of Rosgvardia, Russia's National Guard. This transforms a domestic riot force into a fully independent Second Army. It now has its own war room, its own intelligence directorate, and its own heavy armor. So, why would Moscow upgrade its street level enforcers from batons to battle planning? Because now the war has broken into the Russian interior. As of February 2026, Ukrainian drone strikes are systematically dismantling the Russian rear. They are hitting refineries in Komi and logistics hubs that are 2,000 kilometers, 1,200 miles from the front. And when the state cannot protect its own fuel, ordinary Russians see weakness instead of the supposed victory that's at hand. And this is why the new Rosgvardia war room is a weapon pointed inward. It creates a parallel military that answers to the Kremlin and not to the regular generals. Putin is building a force that he personally can trust, specifically because he can no longer trust the military to hold the line. But this attempt to bypass the military creates a new physical crisis. The manpower once used to intimidate the public is now being stretched thin. These elite units are being pulled off the streets to guard fuel depots and transport arteries. The system starts to lie to itself because truth becomes dangerous and loyalty becomes the only way to survive. But this then creates the dictator's trap. The tighter you grip, the more you lose the ability to feel. They tighten, they centralize, and they overreact until every new control measure creates a new gap. This decree is not a sign of strength. It is a preparation for a breaking point. They are no longer just bracing for drones, they are bracing for the moment that their own people realize that the front is now everywhere. I'm Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a national security advisor and a Kyiv Post special correspondent. For Russia, we are watching as strikes punish the military, and the sanctions today are wiping out their economy. And the Kremlin tries to behave as if everything's okay, that everything's fine. But we see for ourselves that Putin is seriously worried if his military can be trusted. And this is something that's been building for a while. This is something we should have expected. Vladimir Putin today is preparing the troops that he's prepared for years to be his enforcers, to be those who, under any cost, would back his regime, to now take care of the war. That's a bad sign for Russia. That's not a sign of stability. That's a sign that things are actually getting much worse. So help us get the public what's really happening. Subscribe now and help us reach our goal of 275,000 people who support Ukraine. And if you have YouTube's new rolling out hypes that give you 3 free hypes, use one on this video. Subscribing or hyping tell the algorithm this is serious analysis. And if you want to support us from the ground, then please consider becoming a channel member today. So Russia is reorganizing internal forces so the decisions can be made faster, and done so without upsetting the public, without creating panic. But what we see is something that's quite alarming. So Vladimir Putin for years has had this National Guard, Rosgvardia. It's filled with people who are loyalists. It's run by a guy, Zolotov, who was in fact formerly Vladimir Putin's personal bodyguard. He was chosen for this job not because he's a military genius, but because he's personally loyal to Vladimir Putin. In the world of Vladimir Putin, there is no greater currency. But Vladimir Putin has a lot of reasons to worry. We see that right now in the battlefield in Ukraine, that the Russians are being pushed back, that right now their lines are quite weak. They're not prepared for General Winter. And today, General Winter is giving the Russians a beating. Look at the attack that just happened in Volgograd. A huge ammunition storage site near Kotluban was hit and it detonated for hours. More than 2,000 people had to be evacuated. Now imagine this, 450 kilometers, 280 miles from the front lines, Russians today are being evacuated. They are seen as their depots are no longer secure. Their refineries are routinely attacked. Their rail junctions are often found to be on fire. With all this happening, the interior is more of a priority than ever. But the interior is today unguarded. We see that there's been more and more attacks by Ukrainians on things like the Russian railroad system. But it's not the Ukrainian attacks that are the most interesting. It's the Russian attacks. You see, the attacks that are most carried out within Russia on the railroad system are actually carried out by Russians in Russia who are trying to overthrow the Putin regime. There's organizations like Atesh that have been working on this for months. But at the same time, there's other things that Vladimir Putin has to worry about. He remembers very clearly what happened during Prigozhin's uprising with the Wagner troops. When they rolled in the Rostov, they were not stopped by the Russian military. They were not stopped by anyone who they came in contact with, whether there is the police, the border guards, the local police. None of them were able to stop them. So whom can Vladimir Putin trust? The Chechens promised they would take care of him, they would protect him. But we see that today, the leader of the Chechens, Kadyrov, seems to be on the way out. His son hasn't been heard from in months. So if the heir apparent and the leader of Chechnya aren't around to protect him, he has to have someone else. And that someone else is the National Guard. Now, the National Guard today is in a very interesting position. It's in open conflict with other parts of the government, namely with the military. The military is not very excited to see somebody like Zolotov take a position that they consider to be theirs. To take a position they think should be in their hands. How is it possible that today they are not the ones able to lead Russia in a war? And the answer is simple, because they are failing. So Vladimir Putin, looking at all this, he has to wonder, how much longer can this really continue for? How much longer? Until there's a major break in the Russian lines. And that is seeming ever more likely. Consider this. The attacks that we saw on the ammunition was not a small thing. This was attacking a GRAU facility. GRAU is Russia's military supply office for missiles and artillery shells, the warehouse system behind the guns. A GRAU arsenal is a giant storage and repair yard where shells and rockets are prepared for shipment. When a site like that detonates, the result is fewer shells arriving to the front, not just for the next few days, but for the coming weeks and months. Fewer shells means less artillery fire, and less artillery fire means thinner defenses. Fuel becomes the second choke point because trucks and trains still have to move what is left. The logic completes the chain. Rear strikes or reduce supply. Supply drops weakened defenses, and the offensive window grows. Fewer shells reach the guns, so Russia cannot cover attacks with mass artillery fire. Less diesel reaches units, so trucks and armored vehicles sit and wait. Rail schedules slip, and backed up trains become predictable targets. Rotations break, exhausted units stay forward longer, and gaps appear. So if you destroy the shock, you create a choke, and in that, you open a window where the defenders lose the ability to run a timetable. And today, that's what we're seeing. The Ukrainians very clearly have launched a new counteroffensive, but it's probably about to be much bigger. What we've seen so far has been relatively small. It's been very localized. But the Russian side today is weaker than it's been in months. If the Ukrainians were to go full out and start pushing hard on the lines, there is really the chance that they could break. That is how bad the situation is for the Russians. So Vladimir Putin is preparing the Rosgvardia. These are, of course, a new unit. They've only been around for about a decade, but their specific job is to protect the homeland, what goes on inside of Russia. Now that has two different fronts. There's obviously protecting things such as the fuel lines, protecting things such as the refineries, protecting things such as the rail lines. They haven't had a stellar record, but they're trying. The other job they have, which is the most important one, is protecting the Putin regime. Because they're loyal directly to Vladimir Putin and not to the military, there's no chain of command. They just do what Putin wants. And because they're headed by a Putin crony, you can be sure that's exactly what they'll do. But today, that's happening in a way that has not been expected. We saw a few months ago that the National Guard received the right to have tanks. As we've discussed before, typically your National Guard does not have tanks. Tanks are not used for putting down incidences of rioting or of looting. Tanks are used when they're fighting other tanks. And why would the Russian military have to worry about fighting tanks within Russia? What's the National Guard think could happen? Well, it's very clear that they worry that the military could bring their tanks to Moscow with them, in which case they would need some sort of a service, some sort of a force that is able to fight the Russian military. These troops are being prepared not to fight the Ukrainians. They're being prepared to fight Russians. This is a dramatic departure from how this war has gone so far. Up to now, we have not seen anything like what we see today. This is a major step, and is one that probably is highly indicative of how bad the situation in Russia has become. A situation that is getting worse by the day, but Vladimir Putin will not accept. Now, some might wonder what's going to happen though to Zolotov, the leader of the National Guard. Is he likely to become the next person after Putin? Well, given his age, given the fact that today he's so on the outs with everybody in Russia, it seems quite improbable. Much more likely, though, is that he will start to get poached now. He'll have more and more people reaching out to him to see how they can work together, how they can collaborate, how they can split some contracts together. And all of this will continue this cycle of corruption that is destroying the Russian military, and in fact, it's destroying the Russian state. But the good news here is even better than that. These attacks are about much more than simply destroying Russia's fuel lines or destroying Russia's ability to make more money. It's about something more important, and this is how we know it is working. When you carry out attacks in Russia, the real objective is to create political change. The Ukrainians very clearly are seeking to create a Putin-less Russia, and that seems to be getting nearer by the day. Because when you see the government making changes like this, when you see the Kremlin starting all of a sudden to rapidly change things unexpectedly, that's a sign that they're scared of something. What they're scared of, we can't know exactly, but we can look at all the little clues, all the tea leaves, and they all point in one direction. They point in the direction that today, the Kremlin has become incredibly weak. Vladimir Putin as a person is known to be quite paranoid. He is quite worried about his security and rarely leaves his own bunker. Rarely does he even visit Moscow. So when he's making changes like this, it's reflecting something he feels, something that he senses to be an urgency. And that urgency today is very simple, that he realizes that his hours might be running out. And the more that we look at the situation in Russia, it seems that Vladimir Putin is absolutely right. Now, Vladimir Putin is copying something he learned in Russian history. Joseph Stalin himself expanded the NKVD, which is the precursor of the KGB, the precursor of the modern FSB, which had control of the rear during its existential war in World War II. Reinforcement grew when leadership feared sabotage and disloyal reporting. Internal troops gained wartime roles alongside the regular forces, and rear strike accelerated the growth of internal troops in the modern war. Rosgvardia is being shaped into that rear control instrument. A second chain of command appears when leadership expects there might be disloyalty. We saw the same thing happen with the Germans in World War II. But all this is happening simultaneously, and all this is happening right when Vladimir Putin appears to be at his weakest. So despite the fact that the Russians today go into negotiations and they act like everything's okay, that Russia somehow winning, don't be distracted from the truth. It's not so simple. Russia today is not doing well. And one of the reasons that things are not going so well for the Russians is because people, such as yourselves, are helping the Ukrainians to get the life-saving equipment they need to fight and to win. Check out the first pinned comment below with the question of the day and a video that you got to check out to understand the greater context of what's happening. But right below that, you'll see how you can donate for the Ukrainian soldiers to get what they need to win. All donations right now are being matched by a very generous donor. Thank you. So I continue. Consider this. Today, Vladimir Putin is looking at the situation, and he's realized it has become so bad, that it's become so grave, that he needs to have other troops available. That's a very good sign for everybody, because that means that he is going to be stretching himself ever more thin. Russia today is already stretched quite thin. Now, the National Guard is huge, and it's not been deployed to the war zone, but he cannot afford to deploy to the war zone anymore. And the Russian troops today are wholly unequipped. The Russian troops are few in number. And despite offering typically amounts that it would come to several years' salary for someone in a profession like being a teacher or a doctor, they cannot get more people to sign up for that sort of a bonus because they realize it's not really a bonus. You're signing away your life. The Kremlin right now is unsure of what to do, and that's why we see it making illegal things like Telegram and YouTube and other sources. They're scared that people have too much information. But there's another thing going on here. The Russian state itself is changing, and these are all reflections of those changes. Don't consider them to be incidences in isolation. They're all part of a systemic network. The attacks that Ukraine is carrying out, these deep strikes, are not just changing the war. They're changing the Russian state. And the first orders that we see come from this new headquarters of the Russian National Guard will show us who really is commanding the rear, who is going to take decisions on the front. But these same orders will show us which agencies are losing authority and which are gaining it. It's very clear that the next move will reveal whether the Kremlin is preparing for defense or for a total lockdown. check out this video so you understand exactly how this all fits together. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.